The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into their seats, each ready for the long flight ahead. Karen, a seasoned flight attendant with years of experience, adjusted her uniform and took a steadying breath. To her, this was just another day, another routine flight where she would navigate the aisles with practiced ease. Yet, something about this trip felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As she moved through the aisle, her attention was drawn to a young passenger in business class. He was perhaps 16 or 17, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, with a backpack slung at his feet. His headphones were on, and he stared out of the window, seemingly oblivious to the world around him. Karen's brow furrowed. It wasn't common for someone so young to sit in business class, and his relaxed demeanor struck her as odd. Karen's initial instinct was to dismiss him. Probably someone whose parents overindulge him, she muttered under her breath, an edge of irritation creeping in. There were no outward signs of trouble, yet something about the teenager unsettled her. It wasn't his behavior. He was polite and quiet, not drawing any undue attention to himself. But Karen's mind, shaped by years of preconceived notions and assumptions, couldn't help but question his place here. As Karen passed his row again, she noticed the embroidered logo on his backpack, one she recognized from an exclusive private school. Her irritation deepened, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. Was it the way he seemed so self-assured? Or was it simply her mood, compounded by the whispers she had overheard from first class earlier in the flight? Passengers were murmuring about someone important being on board, a tech mogul, a philanthropist. But Karen brushed it off. Every flight has its share of VIPs, she thought dismissively. In the galley, Karen's colleague, a younger attendant with a natural curiosity, leaned in conspiratorially. "Have you heard the buzz?" she whispered. Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning disinterest. "What now?" "Apparently, someone really big is on this flight." Her colleague continued, eyes wide with excitement. "I heard the name, but it didn't register right away. Some billionaire, tech guy turned philanthropist. And get this, his son is sitting in business class." Karen stiffened slightly but forced herself to laugh. "Probably just another overhyped passenger," she said, waving a hand. People in first class love to make a fuss about anyone remotely famous. Her colleague shrugged, her curiosity unshaken. "Maybe, but they say he's been in the news a lot. One of the most influential people in the world." Karen tried to shake off the conversation, but her thoughts drifted back to the teenager. Could it be? No, she told herself firmly. It was just a coincidence. There were plenty of young passengers in business class. Why should this one be any different? Yet, the uneasy feeling in her chest refused to fade. Returning to the cabin, Karen found herself glancing at the boy again. This time, her gaze lingered a little longer. He had adjusted his headphones, leaning back with an air of calmness that seemed to defy his surroundings. A faint trace of a smile played on his lips as he stared out of the window, lost in his own world. For a fleeting moment, Karen felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Was it regret or shame? She quickly pushed the thought aside, rushing off the nagging feeling as irrelevant. Meanwhile, the murmurs from first class grew louder, and Karen couldn't help but catch fragments of the conversation. "I can't believe he's on this flight," one passenger said, their voice tinged with awe. Another replied, "I've read so much about him. He's everywhere these days." Karen frowned, the unease building inside her. She tried to piece together what she had heard earlier with these new clues. A billionaire, a philanthropist, traveling with his son. Her mind raced, but she couldn't connect the dots. And yet, a part of her was beginning to suspect the truth, one she wasn't ready to face. The flight continued uneventfully on the surface, but the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with a quiet tension. Karen's attention kept drifting back to the boy, even as she tried to focus on her duties. Each time she passed his row, her chest tightened, and she had to force herself to look away. The embroidered logo on his backpack now seemed like a glaring sign, mocking her for not seeing the bigger picture sooner. Then, it happened. A tall man emerged from first class, his presence magnetic. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and composed demeanor exuding authority. He moved with quiet confidence, his every step drawing the attention of passengers around him. Karen froze as he approached the boy's row, her heart pounding in her chest. The teenager looked up, his face lighting up with a mix of relief and pride. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice soft but warm. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling as the pieces fell into place. This was no ordinary passenger. This was the man her colleagues had been talking about, the tech mogul, the philanthropist, the billionaire. And the boy she had judged, dismissed, and treated with barely concealed disdain. He was his son. The man placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, speaking to him in low tones that Karen couldn't hear. Around them, passengers began to murmur, their whispers a mix of awe and curiosity. Some discreetly took out their phones, snapping photos or texting updates about the unexpected celebrity in their midst. Karen's face burned with embarrassment. She tried to will herself to move, to do anything that would distract from the growing knot of shame in her stomach. But the man turned toward her, his gaze calm yet piercing. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that made her stomach churn. Karen felt exposed, her earlier behavior laid bare under the scrutiny of the very people she had silently judged. "Is everything all right, miss?" the man asked, his tone polite but cool. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her carefully constructed facade of professionalism was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Around her, passengers watched with barely concealed curiosity, their eyes darting between her and the man. In that moment, Karen realized there was no escaping the truth. She had made assumptions, acted on them, and now those assumptions had unraveled in the most spectacular way. The boy had been quiet, respectful, and unassuming, and she had treated him as though he didn't belong. Now, faced with the reality of his identity, Karen could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. As she stood there, frozen in the aisle, the man's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned back to his son. The boy gave Karen a brief, almost pitying glance before putting his headphones back on. Karen swallowed hard, the noise of the cabin fading into the background as the enormity of her error settled over her like a heavy cloud. This flight was far from over, and Karen knew one thing for certain. She would never forget the lesson it had taught her. Karen's mind swirled as she retreated to the galley, desperate for a moment of solitude to process what had just unfolded. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with a tray of glasses, trying to steady herself. She could still feel the weight of the man's gaze, the silent judgment in his eyes. The memory of the teenager's calm, almost pitying expression stung even more. She had been wrong, so utterly, humiliatingly wrong, and now the entire cabin seemed to buzz with an awareness that she couldn't escape. As Karen busied herself with small tasks, her thoughts drifted back to her early days as a flight attendant. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to handle any situation with grace and composure. But somewhere along the way, she had grown jaded. The long hours, the demanding passengers, the endless flights, they had all taken their toll. She had started to see people not as individuals but as categories, fitting them into neat little boxes based on her assumptions. And now, those assumptions had led her to this moment, a moment she couldn't undo. Karen's colleague, the younger flight attendant, entered the galley, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Did you see him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but brimming with excitement. "That's him asterisk. The guy from all those articles, Ethan Caldwell. He's been all over the news lately." Karen nodded stiffly, trying to feign indifference. "I saw," she said, her voice flat. Her colleague leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. "And the boy? That's his son, right? I heard someone say he's super private about his family. Hardly anyone even knew he had kids until recently." Karen forced a tight smile, though her chest tightened at the mention of the boy. She couldn't bring herself to admit how wrong she had been, how deeply she regretted her earlier assumptions. Instead, she busied herself rearranging items on the counter, hoping her colleague wouldn't notice her discomfort. As the flight wore on, Karen found herself replaying the interaction in her mind, dissecting every detail. She remembered the boy's quiet demeanor, the way he had sat alone, lost in his thoughts. There had been no arrogance, no sense of entitlement, only a calm confidence that Karen now realized was entirely justified. And the man, Ethan Caldwell, his presence had been commanding yet understated, his every movement exuding a quiet power that Karen couldn't ignore. Karen tried to distract herself by focusing on her duties, but it was no use. Every time she entered the cabin, her eyes were drawn to the boy. She couldn't help but notice the way other passengers looked at him now, their curiosity barely concealed. Some tried to engage him in conversation, but he responded politely, offering only brief answers before retreating back into his own world. It was clear that he was used to this kind of attention, and equally clear that he didn't seek it out. In the back of her mind, Karen began to wonder about the boy's life. What was it like to grow up as the son of someone like Ethan Caldwell? To be thrust into the spotlight simply because of who your father was. Karen had read about Caldwell before, the tech genius who had built an empire from scratch, then turned his attention to philanthropy, donating billions to causes around the world. He was a man who had changed countless lives, yet he had managed to keep his own personal life shrouded in mystery, until now. Karen's curiosity deepened as she thought about the boy. What was his story? What had brought him onto this flight, sitting alone in business class while his father occupied a seat in first? And why had Karen been so quick to judge him in the first place? As the flight continued, Karen found herself drawn into the mystery of the Caldwell family. She began to notice small details, like the way the boy occasionally glanced toward first class, as if checking to make sure his father was still there, or the way he carried himself, with a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. There was a quiet strength about him, a sense of resilience that Karen couldn't ignore. The more she observed, the more Karen's guilt grew. She wanted to apologize, to somehow make amends for her earlier behavior. But how could she? She couldn't very well approach him and admit that she had judged him unfairly. The thought alone made her stomach churn. And yet, the idea of leaving things as they were felt equally unbearable. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense, the passengers still buzzing with excitement over Ethan Caldwell's presence. Karen overheard snippets of conversations, each one adding to the intrigue. Some passengers speculated about his latest philanthropic project, while others shared stories they had read about his rise to success. But no one seemed to know much about his son, and that only made Karen more curious. As the flight neared its halfway point, Karen found herself faced with an unexpected opportunity. The boy had gotten up from his seat and was making his way toward the galley, his movements unhurried and self-assured. Karen's heart raced as she realized he was heading straight toward her. When he reached the galley, he gave her a polite nod. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Could I get some water, please?" Karen nodded quickly, fumbling for a glass. "Of course," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She poured the water and handed it to him, her hands trembling. "Thank you," he said, his tone courteous. He turned to leave, but Karen found herself blurting out, "I'm sorry." The boy stopped, turning back to face her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes steady as they met hers. "For what?" he asked, his voice calm. Karen hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to explain, to tell him how deeply she regretted her earlier assumptions, but she couldn't bring herself to say it, not here, not like this. "For anything I might have done to make you uncomfortable," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, to Karen's surprise, he gave her a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," he said simply. "Have a good day." With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Karen standing in the galley, her emotions a whirlwind of guilt, relief, and confusion. She had expected anger or disdain, but instead, the boy had shown her a kindness she felt she didn't deserve. As Karen watched him return to his seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, more to this entire family than anyone truly understood. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself wanting to know the truth, not out of idle curiosity, but because she felt she owed it to them. The flight wasn't over yet, and Karen knew one thing for certain. She would carry this experience with her long after the plane touched down. This was more than just a routine flight, it was a lesson, one she wouldn't soon forget. The cabin lights dimmed as the passengers settled in for the latter half of the flight. Karen's thoughts, however, were anything but calm. Her brief exchange with the boy played over and over in her mind, each replay leaving her with more questions than answers. She couldn't stop wondering about the life he led. What shaped him? What gave him that quiet confidence that seemed unshaken even in the face of her earlier rudeness? It wasn't just the boy now, it was the entire family dynamic. What was it like to be the son of a man who commanded so much respect and attention, yet remained a mystery to the public? And why did it seem like the boy wanted to fade into the background, unnoticed? In her years as a flight attendant, Karen had seen her share of celebrities, dignitaries, and high-profile passengers. She had grown used to the posturing, the entitlement, the way people use their status to demand attention. But there was none of that with Ethan Caldwell or his son. If anything, they seemed to shrink from the spotlight, preferring quiet anonymity over fanfare. And yet, their presence was impossible to ignore. Karen wasn't the only one wrestling with curiosity. In the rows behind the boy, a middle-aged man with a laptop was openly speculating with the woman next to him. "I'm telling you, that kid's got to be the heir to everything Caldwell's built," he said, gesturing toward the boy. "I mean, think about it. A genius father, billions in the bank. Imagine the pressure." The woman nodded, her eyes narrowing in thought. "But why isn't he sitting with his dad in first class? That seems strange, doesn't it? You'd think they'd want to stick together." "Maybe he's trying to give the kids some independence," the man suggested. "Or maybe it's a strategy. Keep the son out of the spotlight. Let him have a normal life for as long as possible." Karen pretended not to listen, but their words only added fuel to the fire of her curiosity. The boy was undoubtedly wealthy and privileged, but there was something about him that felt different, grounded even. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that he had lived through something that had shaped him into the person he was now. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a slight turbulence ahead. Karen used the distraction to make her way through the cabin, checking on passengers and ensuring everyone was settled. When she passed by the boy's seat, she noticed him staring out the window, his expression distant. For a fleeting moment, Karen thought she saw a trace of sadness in his eyes, as if he carried a burden far heavier than his years should allow. Meanwhile, in first class, Ethan Caldwell was equally enigmatic. Karen had avoided that section of the plane since their initial interaction, but she couldn't stop wondering about the man's silence. Why hadn't he confronted her? Any other parent would have been livid, demanding an apology or making a scene, but Ethan had done none of that. His calmness was unsettling, almost as though he had expected her behavior. What kind of man reacts like that? And what did it say about him? And his son? Karen's curiosity grew stronger as the hours passed. She found herself stealing glances toward both father and son, piecing together fragments of their interactions. At one point, Ethan sent a message to the boy through one of the attendants, a folded note that the boy read quietly before tucking it into his pocket. The exchange was so subtle that most passengers missed it, but Karen couldn't help but wonder what it said. Was it a reassurance, a reminder, or something else entirely? As the turbulence passed and the cabin returned to its usual rhythm, Karen decided to distract herself by engaging with other passengers. She stopped to chat with an older woman traveling to visit her grandchildren, helped a young couple settle their fussy baby, and offered a glass of wine to a nervous first-time flyer. But no matter how busy she kept herself, her thoughts always drifted back to the boy and his father. It wasn't until Karen overheard another passenger's hushed conversation that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "I read an article about Caldwell a while back," a woman whispered to her seatmate. "They said he grew up dirt poor, had nothing, built his company from scratch after his wife passed away. Tragic, really." Karen's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Ethan's late wife added a new layer of depth to the story. She glanced toward the boy, wondering how much of that tragedy had shaped him. Had he lost his mother at a young age? Was that where the sadness in his eyes came from? And what kind of father was Ethan? One who built an empire while raising a son on his own. As Karen pondered these questions, she realized something else. Her earlier judgment of the boy hadn't just been unfair. It had been rooted in her own biases. She had looked at him and seen what she wanted to see, a spoiled, entitled teenager. But the truth was far more complex, far more human. And now she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame for how she had treated him. The rest of the flight felt like an eternity. Karen found herself growing more anxious with each passing minute, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. She wanted to make things right, to find a way to apologize that felt genuine and meaningful. But she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough, not for what she had done. As the plane began its descent, Karen's nerves were on edge. The boy remained calm, his expression unreadable as he fastened his seatbelt and prepared for landing. Karen wondered if he would ever truly forgive her, or if she even deserved his forgiveness. And as for Ethan Caldwell, his silence continued to haunt her, leaving her with more questions than answers. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the cabin filled with the usual flurry of activity as passengers prepared to disembark. Karen watched as Ethan rose from his seat in first class, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure as he made his way toward the boy. The two exchanged a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Karen's heart raced as she realized this was her last chance to say something, to do something that might make amends. But as the father and son gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Karen found herself frozen, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. And then, just as they reached the exit, Ethan turned to her. His expression was calm, his eyes steady as they met hers. "Thank you for the service," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. Before Karen could respond, they were gone, disappearing into the crowd of passengers streaming through the terminal. She stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on her shoulders. As the cabin emptied, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, that there was more to come, more to learn. And as she prepared for the next leg of her journey, she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this flight or the lesson it had taught her. Karen stood by the aircraft door, mechanically thanking the passengers as they exited. Her professional smile felt forced, her mind clouded with the events of the flight. Ethan Caldwell and his son had left her with a whirlwind of emotions: shame, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of unease. The boy's quiet demeanor, Ethan's composed silence. It was as if they knew something she didn't, something that had shifted the air around them. As the last passenger left, Karen exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the tension. But before she could collect herself, the pilot appeared at the cabin door with a puzzled look. He held out a folded piece of paper. "Someone left this with the ground crew and said it's for you," he said, handing it over. Karen took the note with trembling hands, her pulse quickening. She unfolded it carefully, half expecting a complaint or a reprimand from Ethan Caldwell himself. Instead, it was a simple message written in neat, precise handwriting. Asterisk, sometimes what you see is only part of the story. Look deeper. Asterisk. There was no signature, but Karen knew exactly who it was from. Her breath caught as she stared at the words, their weight sinking into her chest. The note wasn't accusatory, it wasn't angry. If anything, it felt like a challenge, a reminder that her assumptions had blinded her to something far more significant. The next few hours passed in a blur as Karen went about her duties on the return flight. But her mind remained tethered to the note and the two enigmatic passengers. The boy's quiet resilience, Ethan's measured demeanor. There was a story there, a truth she hadn't been able to grasp in the confines of the plane. And now that truth was pulling her in, demanding her attention. By the time Karen's shift ended, she was too restless to go home. Instead, she found herself scrolling through her phone, searching for anything she could find about Ethan Caldwell. The internet was filled with articles about his meteoric rise, his innovative ventures, and his reputation as a fiercely private man. But it was an old interview, buried deep in the search results, that caught Karen's eye. The video was grainy, the audio slightly muffled, but Ethan's voice was unmistakable. He spoke about his late wife, the love of his life, and the son they had raised together. "She taught me everything about compassion, about seeing the good in people," he said, his expression softening. "After she passed, I made a promise to carry those lessons forward, for her, for our son. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Karen's chest tightened as she listened. This wasn't the voice of a man who thrived on power or arrogance. This was a father, a husband, a human being who had endured loss and found strength in love. And his son, what must it have been like to grow up under the weight of that legacy? The thought sent a pang of regret through Karen. She had judged the boy without knowing his story, without understanding the depth of his experiences. But it wasn't just guilt that gnawed at her. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The note, the exchange of glances between father and son, the way Ethan had looked at her before leaving. It all felt deliberate, almost as if they were trying to tell her something without words. Karen decided she couldn't let it go. She needed closure, an understanding of the mystery that had unfolded in front of her. With a mixture of determination and apprehension, she reached out to a former colleague who now worked in PR for Caldwell Industries. They weren't close, but she hoped their past camaraderie might earn her a small favor. To her surprise, the colleague responded quickly. Ethan doesn't do interviews, they said, their tone cautious. But if this is personal, you might have better luck with his assistant. I can't promise anything, though. Karen thanked them, her heart pounding as she saved the contact information they provided. She wasn't sure what she hoped to gain, a conversation, an explanation, maybe even a chance to apologize, but she knew she couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The following day, Karen dialed the number, her hands shaking as she waited for the line to connect. A calm, professional voice answered. "This is Mr. Caldwell's office. How can I assist you?" Karen hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Hi, my name is Karen. She paused, taking a deep breath. "I was the flight attendant on Mr. Caldwell's flight yesterday. I think I may have offended his son, and I just wanted to apologize." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a thoughtful hum. "One moment, please," the assistant said before placing her on hold. Karen's nerves were stretched to their limit as she waited, the hold music doing little to calm her. When the line reconnected, the voice was different this time. Deeper, steadier. "This is Ethan Caldwell." Karen's breath hitched. She hadn't expected to speak to him directly. "Mr. Caldwell, she stumbled over her words, her usual composure faltering. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I treated your son. It was wrong, and I deeply regret it." Ethan didn't respond immediately, and the silence on the line felt heavy. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but kind. "I appreciate your apology, Karen, but it's not me you need to say it to." Karen's chest tightened. "I don't know how to reach him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then Ethan's voice softened. "Sometimes the best apologies are in actions, not words," he said. "You judged my son without knowing him, but I believe you've learned from that. Take that lesson and carry it forward." Karen felt a lump in her throat as his words sank in. "I will," she promised. "Thank you for giving me the chance to say this." As the call ended, Karen felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. Ethan's words were wise, but they also left her with a sense of unfinished business. She knew she needed to make amends, not just for the boy, but for herself, for the person she wanted to become. What she didn't realize was that her journey of redemption was far from over. The lesson Ethan had imparted was just the beginning, and the road ahead would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And as she reflected on the encounter, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been irrevocably changed by a single flight, a single family, and a single note that urged her to look deeper. Karen couldn't shake the conversation with Ethan Caldwell from her mind. His words had been calm, even compassionate, but there was something in his tone, a hint of finality that made her feel as if their brief interaction wasn't the end of the story. As she went about her day, she found herself replaying the events of the flight over and over, trying to piece together the puzzle of the father and son. The note he had left for her still sat on her kitchen counter, its cryptic message gnawing at her thoughts. That night, as she sat scrolling through articles about Caldwell Industries again, something caught her eye, a local news story about a charity gala happening the following week. The headline named Ethan Caldwell as one of the keynote speakers. Karen's pulse quickened. She had no intention of intruding, but the idea of seeing him again, of possibly understanding the layers of his message, was too tempting to ignore. Her curiosity soon turned into determination. She researched the gala, discovering it was open to the public, albeit with a steep ticket price. Karen hesitated. Was this going too far? But the pull was undeniable. She had to know more, not just about Ethan Caldwell, but about herself. Something about this encounter had awakened a deeper desire to change, to become more than the person who had made that cruel mistake on the flight. When the night of the gala arrived, Karen found herself standing in front of the grand venue, nerves buzzing. She had saved for the ticket and spent hours debating whether she should actually go. Now, as she stepped inside, the opulent surroundings made her feel out of place. The crowd was filled with business leaders, philanthropists, and local celebrities, all mingling with an air of ease. Karen tucked herself into a quiet corner, unsure of what she was even looking for. The evening progressed slowly, with speeches and presentations highlighting the charitable causes the event supported. Ethan Caldwell took the stage toward the end of the night, and the room fell silent as he began to speak. His presence commanded attention, his voice steady and deliberate as he shared personal stories about the importance of compassion and the responsibility of using one's privilege to uplift others. Karen listened intently, her earlier impressions of him deepening. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a man who carried the weight of his experiences with grace and used them to inspire change. But it wasn't until he mentioned his son that Karen felt her breath catch. "My son Jaden has taught me more about resilience than I could ever teach him," Ethan said, his voice softening. "He's faced challenges most people can't imagine, yet he carries himself with dignity and strength. He reminds me every day that true character isn't about how others see you, it's about how you see yourself." Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Ethan's words weren't just about Jaden. They were a reminder of her own shortcomings, of how quick she had been to judge the boy without understanding his world. After the speech, Karen lingered at the edge of the crowd, unsure of what to do next. She wasn't expecting to speak to Ethan, but as the attendees began to disperse, she noticed him standing near the exit, deep in conversation with a man who looked vaguely familiar. It wasn't until she got closer that she recognized him. It was the pilot from their flight. Karen froze, her heart pounding. What were the odds? The two men seemed engrossed in their discussion, but then Ethan glanced in her direction. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Before Karen could decide whether to approach or slip away unnoticed, Ethan said something to the pilot and began walking toward her. "Karen," he greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Karen felt her cheeks flush. "I wasn't sure I should come," she admitted. "But after our conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about everything." She gestured vaguely, her words faltering under his steady gaze. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad you did. Sometimes the hardest part of change is taking the first step." Before Karen could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Dad, we're going to be late for the next stop." Karen turned to see Jaden standing nearby, his posture relaxed but his expression curious. He had grown more confident since their last encounter, and something about his presence made Karen feel both guilty and hopeful. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you on the plane," Karen said, her voice trembling as she addressed Jaden directly. "It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. I've been trying to understand why I made those assumptions, but I know that's not your responsibility." Jaden studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. "Thank you for saying that," he said simply. Karen felt a wave of relief, but before she could say anything more, Ethan glanced at his watch. "We have another commitment tonight," he said, his tone polite but firm. Karen nodded, understanding that their time together had reached its natural end. But as Ethan and Jaden began to walk away, something unexpected happened. Jaden turned back, his expression softening. "Sometimes people get things wrong," he said. "But what matters is what they do after." The words struck Karen like a bolt of lightning, their meaning clear yet profound. As she watched them leave, she realized that the story wasn't just about Ethan Caldwell and his son. It was about her own journey, about finding the courage to face her flaws and become better. But what she didn't know was that this moment, this seemingly small interaction, would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about others, and about the choices that define us. As Karen watched Ethan and Jaden disappear into the bustling crowd, she felt a strange mix of closure and restlessness. It was as if a chapter had ended, but the book wasn't quite finished. She had apologized, and Jaden had acknowledged her words. Yet something inside her whispered that the story wasn't complete. She lingered for a moment, then turned to leave, telling herself it was time to let go and move forward. The next morning, Karen woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter at the gala had left her shaken but determined to live differently. She resolved to volunteer at a local youth mentorship program, hoping to channel her guilt into action. She wanted to learn, to understand people's stories rather than judge them. As she sat down to draft her application, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered, unsure of what to expect. "Karen, it's Ethan Caldwell," came the calm voice on the other end. Karen's breath caught. She hadn't anticipated hearing from him again. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to reach out. Jaden mentioned you last night." Karen's mind raced. "He did? Is everything okay?" "Yes," Ethan said, his tone steady. "But I think there's something you should know. It's about Jaden, and about what really happened on that flight." Karen's stomach tightened as Ethan explained. Jaden's quiet demeanor wasn't just a reflection of teenage shyness or discomfort. He had recently been diagnosed with anxiety stemming from years of being misunderstood and underestimated, often because of his race. The day of the flight, Jaden had been returning from a leadership camp where he faced subtle yet painful discrimination. Ethan's decision to book them in first class had been a small attempt to show Jaden that he deserved respect and belonged anywhere he chose to be. But there was more. Ethan revealed that the message he had left her on the plane was part of a larger plan. He had sensed her discomfort and recognized an opportunity, not to humiliate her, but to challenge her perspective. His choice to speak with her at the gala had been deliberate, giving her a chance to show growth and accountability. Jaden, too, had been watching, curious to see if she would learn from the experience. Karen felt overwhelmed by the revelation, her emotions swirling. She had been a test, in a way, but also a mirror. Ethan's words were both humbling and empowering. She realized that her apology, while sincere, was only the beginning. It wasn't just about what she said, but about how she lived moving forward. Then Ethan's tone shifted, becoming slightly more guarded. "There's one more thing," he said. "Something I didn't mention at the gala." Karen braced herself, unsure of what was coming. "You weren't the only one on that flight who needed to learn something," Ethan continued. "Jaden told me later that he'd noticed you struggling. He saw the way you avoided eye contact, how your posture changed when you interacted with others. He thought you seemed lost, like you were carrying something heavy." Karen's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how visible her inner turmoil had been. "Jaden wanted to remind me," Ethan added, "that even those who hurt us can be hurting themselves. He's wiser than I'll ever be, that boy." Karen felt tears prick her eyes. The very person she had wronged had seen her pain and chosen compassion. It was almost too much to bear. Ethan's voice softened. "He said you deserve a chance to find your way, just like everyone else." In that moment, Karen felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't waste the opportunity to change. A week later, Karen was volunteering at the youth mentorship program. On her first day, she found herself paired with a quiet boy named Marcus who reminded her of Jaden. As they talked, she caught glimpses of the same resilience and curiosity that Ethan had described in his son. It felt like a full-circle moment, a chance to give back and honor the lessons she had learned. But just as Karen began to settle into this new chapter, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note and a small polished stone engraved with the word *resilience*. The note was from Jaden. "Karen, thank you for listening and for trying. It's all anyone can ask for. This stone is from the leadership camp I attended. We were asked to give it to someone who inspired us to keep going. I thought about it for a while, and I realized it belongs with you. Jaden. Karen held the stone tightly, her heart full of gratitude and resolve. The story hadn't just been about a mistake or a moment of redemption. It was about connection, understanding, and the power of choosing to see the best in one another, even when it wasn't easy. And as she placed the stone on her desk, Karen knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, for her and for anyone willing to grow from their missteps.